Welcome back. This is lesson number 5. Okay, so we have our questions. That was the first step. What's the second step? Well, the second step is to know where you go to get your answers. In other words, where to find the kinds of sources you need and collect for analysis and presentation. In this lesson, I'm going to show you 7 types of sources you can turn to for any case. And then I'm going to talk about how you can find them online and where you can find them online. And finally, I'll close with the continued example of Jay from Cameroon. So here you have 7 different types of sources you can turn to. And I'll just go over them quickly. First, you have Department of State human rights reports and other US government writings. I'm sure you know about State Department human rights reports, and I'll say more about that a little later. But there are other government publications you should be considering, including travel advisories, Congressional Research Service reports, and so on. You kind of have to use these. It's what the adjudicators will primarily rely on, but beware because they can be pretty misinformed. And they do follow the general lines of U.S. foreign policy, which can make them turn a blind eye to persecution committed by U.S. allies. And there's quite a lot of U.S. allies in this world. So that's a really good reason why it's important to know what other sources you have available and why you should exercise some cautions when you use U.S. government publications. You then have humanitarian non-governmental organization and international non-governmental organization reports and articles. The big ones include Amnesty, International Rescue Committee, Human Rights Watch, and so on. The international big ones include the UN and its various agencies. Next to government reports, I'd say that the US government and adjudicators consider that these carry the most weight. They tend to be very current and comprehensive, so you'll find a lot of information on abuses, human rights abuses related to specific events, specific groups, specific dynamics, and so on. And at this point, my feeling is that they're really kind of meant to be used in favor of asylum seekers. So this is a really good source that you can turn to and you should turn to. You then have national, local, and international news media. Pretty self-explanatory. One thing to note, though, is the different geographical scopes. For the most current events in specific locations, local media may be best if that's available to you. But then again, for certain regions like the Middle East, another media might be most useful. Like Al Jazeera, for example, is one of the best sources for the Middle East. Another thing to note with media, sometimes it's useful to know that the best media on a certain region comes from countries that used to have colonies in that region. I know it sounds kind of weird, but that's how it is right now. So for example, because France used to colonize a lot of Africa, a lot of North Africa, and other parts of Africa, including Cameroon, there's actually quite a lot of good information in French speaking media on Cameroon and other African countries. So that's good to note. If you kind of feel you're a little stuck with the news media, you might consider which kind of Western country has a past, let's say historical past, with the country of origin, because you might find some really good information, news information in that Western country. Okay, we then have academic books and articles. A few things to note here. These don't tend to be as current as news media or NGO reports. They often address persecution in more depth, and they provide really good historical context or just broader context in general. They're often written by experts in the field, which really gives them a lot of weight if you can find a use for them. And the last thing I want to say about this type of source is that we see more and more academics publishing very short pieces in something called The Conversation, which is a very accessible news source written entirely by academics. And I've actually written several pieces for this outlet, and I strongly encourage you to go to the conversation, because there you'll get really solid academic research presented in a news media format, which is, I think, ideal in this context. We then have foreign countries' country of origin reports or other writings. I don't know if you knew this, but some countries have their own country conditions research offices, and they publish their own reports and briefs. These countries include Sweden, they include Canada, and the United Kingdom, for example. They tend to be pretty detailed. They're often good on specific themes, like, say, genital mutilation, and they will carry a lot of weight because they're written by government agencies, and the U.S. government, just for that reason alone, will tend to look favorably on them. But they tend to be more detailed, and they'll cover more than US reports. So that might be an interesting and good source to turn to. We then have the country of origin, official laws, policies, and press statements. So this can be good to include to directly show that the laws and rules of the country of origin by design lead to persecution or have led to persecution. But beware, sometimes the laws look really good on paper, but aren't applied in practice or are contradicted in practice. And then this gap between the letter of the law or the theory and practice is something you'll have to explain. And in that case, having access to these other sources will definitely help you out. Finally, there's documents from persecuted groups, organizations, and parties. So this can be really good if an applicant belonged to a movement or group or organization that made public statements which really highlight or showcase what the movement or organization was about and how its activities or its opinions led to persecution. This might not always be available, but if it is, it's good to include. Now, often you won't be using sources from all 7 types at any given time or for any given case, but I'll bet you that you'll need some for some cases and others for other cases. So it's just good to know that you have all these options. And I think especially in unfamiliar or new cases where you just don't know that much, it can be vital to have access to different information channels because you just don't know where the most useful information will come from. And in general, I'd say it's really good to have information from as many different kinds of sources as possible that are as independent from each other as possible. And that's because this clearly signals to the adjudicator that the information you're presenting is credible and that it's objective. Okay, so where do you find these 7 different types of sources? You should be able to find most of them online. Some of these sites I'm sure you know about. Others will require some Googling or just learning by trial and error. But I'm mentioning some of these here just for your benefit, and I put in more in the research guide, so you can turn to the research guide to find more links. The links change, so you may have to do a Google search if and when a site changes its URL. And the links here are pretty self-explanatory. You can just click on one of them to identify and collect your sources. A few notes, though, about this. Each site here is searchable. Apologies. Each site here is searchable, and you should use that function to quickly access what you need to know to answer your questions. Some sites won't do you any good, really, unless you search them, especially the academic ones, because they can contain sources from a ton of topics, from astrophysics to zoology. But these can be really good to find information about different or unfamiliar terms. So just use that search function. And then a final note here, when it comes to the sources on the laws and persecuted groups, well, that'll just depend on the country and the language in which these sources are written. So I didn't want to mention any specific examples there because there's just too many of them. But I do want to give you an example of how I went about finding and collecting these sources. In the case of Jay from Cameroon, that I introduced in an earlier lesson. So you can see here that I collected sources from all 7 types, simply because it was relevant in this case. The applicant was a member of a political party, and there was documents published by that party. Because I can read French, I could find and translate Cameroonian government laws, so that proved to be pretty helpful. How did I go about finding and getting these sources? Well, I just visited the websites above and Googled for other websites. I tried to find them one by one, and I always had in mind the questions I wanted to answer, the questions I mentioned in an earlier lessons. So, as I was searching, I would always ask myself which sources would allow me to answer my questions. And then I just start looking. I started with Department of State reports. I went on to NGO sources, found stuff there by Human Rights Watch and Freedom House, for example. For news sources, I searched on Google for reputable sources on Cameroon, found Al Jazeera, France 24, The Guardian, and Africa News. Note here how I found a French source, again, because of that relationship that France has or had with Cameroon. And I also found Africa News, or it's a source that I already knew from the past. Africa News is a good source that covers developments and events in Africa, in the African countries. Google News is a decent aggregator to start with if you are out of ideas. It really, if you search Google for the terms you're interested in, it will get you information from the usual suspects: the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian, the Reuters, Associated Press, Al Jazeera, CNN, NBC, and so on. For academic stuff, in this case, I went to Google Scholar, which is a searchable aggregate engine, and I searched for example, I searched for Cameroon authoritarianism, just to see if I could find a scholarly piece that would help me explain this term to adjudicators. And I actually did. I found an article that's linked here, which allowed me to do just that. As for governmental sources outside the US, I was able to find a useful piece on the German Agency for Development and their website, which describes Cameroon as authoritarian. And I mention it here just to show you that there can be a number of government agencies, especially foreign ministries and development agencies and migration agencies, that have useful information. So you may want to consider searching some of the bigger countries like Canada, Germany, Australia, and the UK. For Cameroon's laws, I searched the government website and found a relevant law on terrorism, which defines terrorism extremely broadly. So broadly, it can arguably be used to persecute democratic opposition parties. And finally, for the opposition parties, I identified 2 major ones, and each had a website, but only one was working. Unfortunately, that I couldn't include that in my collection. But the content here isn't really the key thing I want to convey to you. The key thing is I want you to see how I'm structuring my search and my collection of sources. The search allows me to be comprehensive. It gives me multiple options. It gives me access to a wealth of information coming from sources that are independent from each other. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. And all this really serves to build a really strong evidence base for the client's claims. Okay, you can now move on to the next lesson.